Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on wherever you're joining us from. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and listen today. We really appreciate it. And I think we have a great presentation for you on the Workzone Data Exchange, as well as a really great panel of speakers as well. Not that I'm biased as one of those speakers, but we'll go ahead and do some quick introductions. My name is Caitlin Schneider. I'm a solutions manager here at Sanborn within the FHWA division. And I'll kick it over to Aaron to go ahead and introduce himself and the rest of our presenters as well.
Hello, everybody. My name is Aaron Branson. I'm with the Texas Department of Transportation. Uh, Official role is a special projects coordinator, but my primary duties are to help oversee our road condition website of Drive Texas and back-end system of HCRS. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mark.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Lockett. I'm an engineer up at the Volpe Center, which is part of the U.S. Department of Transportation.
Uh-oh, I think Todd might be. Did we lose his audio? Or is he on mute?
There we go. Uh, uh Beginner error there. Todd Peterson, Transportation Specialist, Federal Highway Office of Operations, the Program Manager for WZDX and the Managing Disruptions for Operations Data Exchange.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank y'all. So just to give everybody a high-level outline of what we'll be talking about today, we'll start off with an overview of what the Workzone Data Exchange is, get into the specifications of it, why it matters, why it's being used. Then look at an example from Texas of the source data that they're using, why they wanted to do this, and how they went about that feed development, as well as how you can go ahead and register a feed yourself within the Workzone Data Exchange, and how the Workzone Data Exchange fits into other FHWA initiatives and some potential future directions as well. So with that, I will go ahead and kick it over to Todd to get things going.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, just what this slide shows on the left side is a little bit of you call it a roadmap, if you will, of the history of Workzone Data Exchange over over the past several years. Yeah, the genesis of the Workzone Data Exchange was, something we were, batted around internally for a long time, and just recognized the lack of authoritative information on Workzone activity at a national level. And that lack of knowledge just made it difficult to do rudimentary things that are part of our job. A couple examples I could bring up is being responsive to media inquiries. Questions like how many work zones are there in the country? That we don't have that answer, and if you ask many of the states, they don't have that answer either. And that lack of awareness of exactly where and when the work zones are occurring made it very difficult for us to develop any kind of useful, meaningful performance metrics around based on work zone exposure and safety and that kind of thing. I think if you go on our website, our best attempt at making that kind of performance metric points back to an urban mobility report from year 2000 or something like that. So it remains a knowledge and capability gap based around the lack of the kind of a national grasp of where and when our work zones are occurring. So these same challenges are experienced by our state and local partners, and also for industry, who's their interactions with states is largely driven by a need to maintain or create systems that are bespoke, tied to legacy IT systems. So we're trying to break some ties to that to really make a data that's easily accessible, it's easily shareable, and really opens things up to a marketplace where products that are developed with compatibility for WZDX in mind are instantly scalable across the country. So you develop a product that runs WZDX, that's immediately marketable to the roughly 90,000 federal, state, and county governments across the country. So there's a distinct value proposition there. Next slide. So where we are with the current state of affairs with WZDX, I'm going to give a caveat. This map is dynamic and changing to the extent that between the dry run that we had on earlier this week, and today, we've gotten word that Idaho is now added to the added to the list of states currently providing a work zone data exchange feed here. So what this map is showing is everybody in orange is a state that has demonstrated the capability to produce a WZDX feed, and that feed is included on the registry. With you can see the link at the bottom right there is the registry, which you could call our phone book for uh, agencies providing WZDX feeds. So we're with the addition of Idaho, that we are up to 25 states plus the National Park Service that are actively producing work zone data exchange fees at this point. The states listed in blue are the ones that we're aware of who are actively working towards developing a feed, and there's probably more that are works in progress that we're not immediately aware of. But it's pretty interesting. It's taken roughly 5 points or 5 years to get from nothing to better part of half of the country deploying work zone data exchange. Yeah, so another 5 years, maybe we can go for the whole country. We'll see about that. A couple caveats on this map. The orange color is indicative of the capability to produce a feed. It does not mean that every state or every work zone within that state is being uh, captured in that feed. So that's an area that we're looking to further develop is expanding the spread of the coverage of WZDX to capture those additional work zones. Another point on this slide, the yellow stars here are those were the direct recipients of the Work Zone Data Exchange demonstration grants. NOFO issued, I think, back in 2020 and issued in 2021. Those effectively wrapped up, and those are, those recipients, use that to kind of help kick off their internal state efforts. But what's also interesting is the number of states and agencies that are producing the feeds that didn't receive the grant. They've done it because they've recognized the value of it for themselves. Perhaps the most notable for the context of this presentation being Texas. So look forward to hearing their experience on this. I guess I'll wrap this up with just noting that as this process started as a collaborative process in creating an open specification with our state, local industry partners, that's since moved to the standardization process to get the WZDX specification approved as standard. So that's in the works, and I think the next steps that it's worth mentioning here. In addition to getting better state coverage, I think this leaves us well positioned to focus on another areas, which is the corridor deployment or interstate corridor deployment, which is there's a number of interstate corridors that we're looking at exercising cross state integration and utilization of work zone data exchange to test really what the benefits of the data sharing and the integration of transportation management leveraging the access to this data across state boundaries and interagency boundaries. So that's going to be a near-term focus going forward. A lot of discussions in that area. But I'm sure many people on this call might be involved in those efforts going forward. So stay tuned. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Mark.
Thanks, Todd. So Todd's kind of given the overview of where we've been, where we're going with WZDX. Before we dive into the rest of the presentation, I want to shine a little bit more light into the actual content of that specification, which, as Todd mentioned, is now becoming a standard, very close to being finished with that process as well. So WZDX actually includes two feeds, specified feeds. We're talking today mostly about the work zone feed, which is for conveying where the work zones are located on the road network. That data is generally produced by transportation agencies as an authoritative data source and delivered to the traveling public via third parties, such as mapping and navigation companies or to CAVs. But in addition to the work zone feed, the WZDX specification and the connected work zone standard includes a device feed, which is used for communicating information about the location of connected devices in work zones to an IOO in order to help make real-time data more available because many state DOTs have a hard time keeping track of where work is actually happening compared to where work is permitted to happening. So on the right side of the screen, you have a flow chart, which kind of represents the information flow that is envisioned with the specification becoming standard. We collect information about device locations that is compiled at a device equipment manufacturer, and that information is compiled into a device feed and shared with an IOO. And then the IOO can combine the device feed information with information about where there are plans for there to be work zones and communicate real verified data out to the public via mapping companies or vehicle OEMs using the work zone feed. So that's how this all plays together. And with that, I'll hand it over to Aaron to talk about how TxDOT has approached developing their work zone feed.
Thanks, Mark. As Mark said, I'm with the Texas Department of Transportation. We're just going to kind of look today for the purpose of this presentation, kind of, what data sources TxDOT currently already had before the Work Zone Data Exchange feed, kind of, what they are, how they're used, how we do have a Drive Texas API, which I'll explain that in a minute, and then kind of how we got to this whole Work Zone Data Exchange feed with Mark and Todd and Caitlin and the rest of kind of, why y'all are at this presentation and interested in what we have to say. So with that, let's just jump right on into it and go right ahead. So next slide. So starting out, we have Drive Texas, our drivetexas.org. This is TxDOT's public-facing road condition website. It shows current road conditions for our on-system roadways. So if you look at the image there to the right, each one of those little icons is a road condition, whether it's construction, which is what most people are here today interested in, work zones, accidents, damage, closures, anything of that nature. Each one of those icons represents a road condition. This information is updated every 5 minutes. So as those conditions get added or as they expire, this data does change on the map in 5-minute intervals. It is viewable on any web-enabled device, so that's phone, tablet, or computer. I always like to joke in these presentations that if you have a smart refrigerator that has internet access with a web browser, you can view Drive Texas on it if you absolutely want to. Don't know who would do that, but it is available if you absolutely want to do that. Throughout the course of the year, as far as the travel division for TxDOT is concerned, we do see about 3 million sessions or views of Drive Texas. Naturally, those are significantly higher during a severe weather event. So say a hurricane or a winter storm, we do see an influx of sessions, but a typical 4,000-degree day here in the middle of August, probably not so much. So with that, so I've talked about what that those are that those symbols are road conditions. So how do those road conditions get to Drive Texas? So we'll go to the next slide and see how that actually happens. That happens through HCRS. HCRS is TxDOT's internal highway condition reporting system. It's used to report those current conditions for our on-system roadways throughout the state. This was built in-house, and it's managed by a TxDOT team from the travel division, the IT division, and our IT vendors. So basically what happens here is this is the application where users go in, actually put all of that granular data. So they select the roadway, they put a start point and an end point, they set an end time, give some information about that data. So when it shows up on, after it's submitted and it shows up on Drive Texas, that's what the traveling public actually sees, and that's how they get their information and, or is aware of what's actually going on all across the roadways. So a lot of great user input there that we do. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at those users. TxDOT currently has over 1,800 users that have access to HCRS. So those are the users that are actually putting those conditions in. These users are full-time employees or contractors, excuse me, and they're spread out across the 25 districts across Texas. Each of these districts has a HCRS coordinator and a backup coordinator. So they are there to help provide support, whether that's training material, just general questions, correspondence, anything of that nature. These coordinators' roles range across a wide variety of different job roles, whether that's a PIO, a public information officer, a contract specialist, a administrative assistant, or just a normal maintenance person. There's not a specific job role that says, "Hey, you have this job role, therefore you are a HCRS coordinator." And then each of those districts also are responsible for their own entry. So naturally, with the state as big as Texas, El Paso is responsible for conditions out in El Paso. Houston's responsible for conditions out in Houston, and they don't overlap because, as I said, this is information that's being inputted by TxDOT employees that we want to actually have, visual representation of and can verify it. So the travel division does provide training for our coordinators as well as our users. This happens a couple of ways, either by request. So if a a district reaches out to us and says, "Hey, I would like to have training, an updated training class," or "Hey, I've got a lot of new users. We want to make sure that they're aware of how to use HCRS." We can provide that training for them. And then we also do it every year or two. We will reach out to all the districts and say, "Hey, we're providing training sessions just to keep the information up to date, make sure that our users are familiar with how to use the input system and application." So next slide. So I mentioned a while ago that, about Drive Texas and the road conditions. Well, Drive Texas actually has its own API. And this actually came about during Hurricane Harvey. So as Hurricane Harvey was coming through Texas and, doing what it did, DPS actually reached out to us. The Texas Department of Public Safety reached out to us and said, "Hey, we're struggling with looking at our data and your data at the same time. We're continually having to bounce back and forth between the two applications to see where we can go, what we can do, how to navigate through this actual natural disaster." So we reached out, as far as TxDOT, the travel division reached out to our IT division and came up with a very thrown together, crude, makeshift API feed, literally in the middle of a hurricane. And got it to DPS, got it to our other first responders, where they were able to take that information, overlay it onto their system, and not have to bounce back and forth across screens. Fast forward a little bit to the end of Harvey. Recovery efforts are wrapping up. We're starting into the rebuilding phase, or getting into the rebuilding phase. So as the travel division looked at it, we decided, well, okay, we don't need the API anymore. So we turned it off. And very shortly after we turned off the API, we got a phone call from the Department of Public Safety again saying, "Hey, we're no longer seeing your data anymore on our system. Like, did you turn the API off?" And we're like, "Yeah, like it's hurricane's over. We're good to go." And they're like, "No, no, no. We would like to have that information all the time. It's valuable information to have." And so we were like, "Oh, okay." So we went back to the IT division, met with our IT vendors, and came up with a more, I won't say elaborate, but a more refined API that wasn't built in the middle of a hurricane. And that became the baseline for what we've essentially used going forward with that. So getting into what the meat and potatoes of why y'all are here today and the work zone data exchange. So that will be the next slide. As TxDOT as a whole, as for business needs, you always ask the important questions, the who, what, when, where, and why questions. Today we're going to look at the what and why pretty much specifically. So what were the major drivers for having a work zone data exchange feed? Well, it originally came about through autonomous trucking companies and autonomous vehicles. They were actually the first ones to reach out to us and say, "Hey, we would really like to have your construction data that you have in Drive Texas so that we can start mapping, autonomous routes across the state, and vice versa, and wherever, so that, we can see what construction zones are coming up, what are kind of tricky to navigate, and may need to be taken off of autopilot and gone to an actual live person, and vice versa. Shortly after the trucking companies and autonomous vehicles reached out, the third-party mapping companies reached out to us. They wanted to be able to take this data as well and get it out to the traveling public, which is great. That's what we're here to do. We are here to help the traveling public. So third-party mapping companies like Google, TomTom, Waze, Apple Maps, they wanted our data. So we got to looking at it and then decided, so we already had the API, why have a work zone data exchange feed? Well, specifically going back to the example for autonomous vehicles, they were primarily concerned with and interested in just the work zones. So with the work zone data exchange feed, it's a national federal highway standard format, which means that anybody that does this feed follows the same format. Was, Todd put the map up earlier, if it's California or Texas or Idaho that just came on board. Any of those states, if you're shipping goods across the continental United States, they all follow the same format, so that you can then just grab each feed and build one giant route from start to end of where you're going, and not having to piece 50 different API feeds together in different formats to try to make one thing all work. So that leads us into the next point with that. It's just go back. It's just an easily consumable form of information. Again, it's one set standard across however many API feeds that you actually need, that the consumer, whether that's the mapping companies or the autonomous trucking companies, can go in and just input not have to rewrite the code for each individual feed. They can just plug and play into their systems and go on. Which brings us to the last point that I have there of why Drive Texas and HCRS. Like I said, we already had these applications for submitting road conditions or displaying road conditions to the traveling public that is a verified and accurate source of information. These, again, are our boots on the ground people. The districts are responsible for each one of their own conditions, their own deal. So they are verified by a TxDOT employee or contractor. So it's a reliable source of information. It's not just open source or third-party information of somebody going, yeah, I saw a construction zone at this area, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and then they go plug it in. And it may not even have been the right area that they plugged it in at. It may have been there, but it's no longer active anymore. So with this, it is verified information from a government source. And so with that, I'm going to pass it along to Caitlin to kind of tell us, how they took the TxDOT information and created the work zone data exchange feed.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, so just to give you a bit of an overview of how we got from kind of point A to point B of taking the source data that TxDOT staff are entering in from the field and pushing that out into the world as a component of the work zone data exchange. So we'll start with taking the data directly from HCRS and uploading it into the Google Cloud Platform, or GCP. And will be a separate upload process from the main Drive Texas site that Aaron demonstrated, that we have for the Drive Texas API and the work zone data feed. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's distinct in a minute. Once we have the data in GCP, we'll go ahead and crosswalk it into the WZDX specifications, sometimes hard coding a little bit of information where needed, and then doing a little bit of data transformation and creation, and then finally pushing it out into the world as a GeoJSON. And before I get any further, I realized in my introduction, I totally forgot to mention that if there's any questions at any point in the webinar, please feel free to drop in anything in that Q&A tab or the chat as well, down there on the bottom of your screen. So apologies on that, but hopefully we can get that sorted. So if you could go ahead to the next slide for me, Jordan, that'd be great. Okay, thank you. All right, so crosswalking itself, so there is the specification and standardization of the WZDX, like everyone has mentioned. I think Todd and Aaron hit on it really well of saying, we want this to be consumable for everybody. So no matter if you're coming up from California or if you're coming, from New Hampshire, you'll always be consuming that data in a consistent way. So we took the data from HCRS and crosswalked it into that specification. There are some elements that are required, so just maintaining that consistency, like I mentioned, but really nothing too strenuous. Sometimes it was just hard coding, TxDOT is the publisher of this information, or just saying, the route name in WZDX is going to be the route name in HCRS. So there wasn't anything that we need to ask users to change how they entered information, or do things differently within HCRS itself. It was really just dropping it in, sometimes doing a little bit of string parsing or conditional logic, like the optional elements, just to add a little bit more detail to an event itself. So instead of giving a longer text description, for example, of where a roadway condition was happening from, we were able to parse it out and just kind of give those clear delimited streets, for an example of that. So fortunately, nothing too crazy, relatively straightforward just to get it into that standardized form. So if you could take it to the next one. So the next piece of thing we needed to do was a little bit of data transformation and creation. So there are two core components of the WZDX specification that we wanted to make sure we were hitting. One of those is having a record for each direction of cardinality that a event is impacting. So if there is a construction event that's closing down both the northbound and southbound side of a highway, we want to have two conditions that represent that. One for the northbound, one for the southbound, and digitized in those directions as well. So the way we get this data from HCRS is there's a field that will tell us, hey, this is impacting the westbound side or the eastbound side, or maybe both, just the northbound and southbound. But it will only give us one direction, so one singular piece of geometry. So what we would do was, if that field was indicating to us both northbound and southbound or eastbound and westbound, we would take the route and then calculate the starting and ending points. So we would look at where the coordinates are beginning and where the coordinates are ending to determine what direction that route was moving in. So if the starting points were less than the ending points, then we knew it was probably a north to southbound route, for example. So that way we then could take it and then flip it around. So that way we had another piece for the north to southbound route. So as an autonomous vehicle, or any cars traveling with a mapping application that's consuming the data, they'll hit that record with the appropriate direction of cardinality. And then similar for the multiple day conditions. So unfortunately, Texas has a lot of roadways to maintain, so a lot of construction that sadly is not one and done things. They typically last for several months or weeks at a time. So what we do is we look at the starting date and ending date that HCRS users are entering. So they can just tell us it's starting August 1st and ending August 30th, for example. And so we'll look at that and say, okay, that's great. We then need to create a day for every day in which that condition is going to exist within the work zone data feed. So instead of having a singular event that just sits around there, we'll have a unique condition for each day where that's occurring. And then finally, integrating it into the API. So if you can go ahead and do the next slide for me as well. Thank you. Sorry about that. So integrating into the API, like I said, we use a separate upload process, so there's no impact to Drive Texas. And the reason why we do that is for us, maintaining the stability of and integrity of Drive Texas is first and foremost priority. So if there's an event going on, like a hurricane or some other natural disaster, and folks are trying to get out and evacuate safely, they need to be able to know what routes to do that. So we want this to always be available for them to safely use. So if there's an uptick in traffic, say the feed becomes really popular, or there is another event like a hurricane or something where people would be requesting that data a lot, a high uptick in usage is not going to have any impact to the main site itself. So it allows us just to give a little bit more control and flexibility over that process. And once we have the data within the API feed, we wanted to keep it very similar for users. So right now, you just have to request a key that gets approved and reviewed by TxDOT staff, and then it will be emailed to them. So with the WZDX feed, we wanted that to go through a similar workflow, but not necessarily have that approval piece, just to kind of keep with the openness and easeability of sharing the data. So users can just request a key, and then it will be sent to them via email. This does allow TxDOT staff just to keep an eye on things and track and monitor keys, just in case there's anyone abusing the key or anything like that. So just kind of a handy tracking mechanism as well. So what does this actually look like? Hopefully pretty intuitive and streamlined for users. If you want to go ahead and do the next slide. Wanted to make it very simple to do. So all a user needs to do is type in their email address and then click request WZDX key. And once they do, that request API key button will turn blue and they can go ahead and click that and that key will be sent to them via email. So they'll have that as well with some documentation, and TxDOT will have a record of who requested the key and what date they did it on. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thanks, Caitlin. So after finishing all those steps, getting your feed up and running, if you need an API key, setting up that system, the last step that we ask you to follow is to register your WZDX feed on the feed registry. Todd mentioned that this is kind of like the phone book. It's our list of all of the WZDX feeds across the country. It also gets your state orange on the map that we showed at the top of the presentation. And this is important primarily because the WZDX feed registry is the primary point of discovery for data consumers. So most of the folks or companies who have integrated WZDX into their systems are pulling from the data feed registry to know which data feeds to go and look for and get workzone information from. The initial part of the process of getting your feed added is that you should check your feed for compliance with the WZDX specification and business rules prior to publishing. There's a guide on the WZDX GitHub site, which is still online, even though that specification is becoming standard. And that guide includes information on how to automatically check that the feed that you're producing is compliant with the specification using something called the JSON schema, which essentially checks that you're following all of the right formats and data fields and whatnot. So once you've done that, listing your feed is easy. Just reach out to the emails on the screen, either abdx@dot.gov or to me directly, letting us know that you have a feed ready to go, and we'll take a quick look, review it, check some of the business rules, multiple directions that Caitlin was talking about for the TxDOT feed. And then once everything's good to go, we'll add your feed to the registry and get it out into the world. That's it for me on that slide, and I'll pass it over to Todd to finish us up.
All right, thanks, Mark. Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to step into what's our next steps here. Some of you that have worked with Federal Highway are familiar with our kind of a internal rebrand we've experienced over the past several years, which has had the purpose of combining the work zone, incident, and road weather management teams under an umbrella of what we're calling managing disruptions for operations. So I'd state that just to provide some clarity to the origin of the acronyms I'm going to be using here, which is MDODE, which stands for Managing Disruptions for Operations Data Exchange, which is the next step in kind of this evolution, building off of what we've learned from WZDX and using that as a springboard to expand this same capability for consistent, coherent data access to other types of disruption events affecting operations, namely incidents, special events, road weather events. So the idea is to bring the same functionality that we have for WZDX to these other types of events as well. So we have work zone data exchange. You see on the right of this slide, we're also pointing to the weather data environment, which is a standing asset that we have. It's a website you can go to right now, and it provides access to sensor data at whatever weather sensor data is available for weather observations across the country. So that's another data asset that we're going to draw upon here. Excuse me. So the process Caitlin described, it really highlights one of the key challenges for what we're trying to do with MDOD, and that's how to get data into the system. It's easy to standardize what a data specification is describing an event, but it's very difficult to standardize the process for data creation. We're talking about events and management strategies that for years and years and years has been a very, very manual, hands-on data entry, phone calls and pen on paper type process, and trying to automate that as much as possible. And we need to accommodate many indoors because there's, an infinite variety of processes being used to generate this data at the state and local level. And we need a process to be able to accommodate that if we ever hope to have this coherent data exchange that's functional at a national level. So what this slide is trying to present here is how each of these data schemas fall under, kind of a collaborative governance framework, highlighted by this greenish large square here, titled Managing Disruptions to Operations. And you see those uh, bars across the top for policy and governance and data discovery and support services. So really there's a management layer that we envision, uh, that all these different data types will need to accommodate, um, and be governed by to facilitate national access. So that to get into the system, we want to make sure that we're testing data for valid quality, reliability, make sure there's no junk data getting into the system, make sure the data security is provided so there's no rogue actors um, pushing data out in a way that it could, then be churned back to the public. This is an important part of the framework, is to have this data governance structure in place to facilitate data coming in from many, many different sources, uh, to then be turned around for public consumption. Next slide. So this slide is, we recognize we're not the only game in town talking about operations data. So this is a very rudimentary, you can visualize a sort of a Venn diagram of where MDODE slots in, among many other, and we've just mentioned a few here in the blue squares. Other data sets that kind of fall under the same category of, coming from a variety of sources and needing needing public access. So the nodes indication here that you see in the upper right, that's talking about an idea that's been raised to serve as that framework for this overarching uh, amalgamation of data, and in providing that necessary data governance framework that these data sets and providing access to them can operate in. And the nodes refers to national operations um, data exchange system. Um, Potentially, we're not married to the branding, but that's where we're going with right now. So that's what we're working with. Next slide. So this is a little deeper dive into the nodes framework. Again, there's a number of data sources and a number of each agency kind of has its own process for managing how data is created within their own systems. But to facilitate national access, that is managed through the nodes framework as we envision it currently. So we'll be working with, agencies, data providers, and as I mentioned, in these coalition-oriented activities such as the transcontinental corridor activities that we have going forward, to determine what nodes needs to look like. So this is very much in its infancy. Um, and we'll be working collaboratively to develop those rules for access and rules for data security to provide that necessary level of control over, what's being pushed out to the public. Next slide. So this is kind of a glimpse of our 5-year roadmap here. Again, we recognize that the info what we're doing here with the data exchange, we're not doing this in the vacuum. There's a lot of people working on how to make data available, Sanborn being one of them. There's a lot of parties that are, trying to that they want to be able to produce data and work with, how to push it out to the public, make things easier for the state agencies. So the federal role here is really one of facilitation and convening and for the sake of collaboration here. And there's four key areas that we really want to focus in on for this. One is the need to facilitate the creation of these data standards and specifications that will fuel this collaborative data exchange going forward. Um, Next is sustainability and succession planning, which is what we envision here. We're not talking about building a large federal IT infrastructure dealing with data exchange. So there's a lot of discussion about what does it look like? Who takes over from once the federal role has completed doing the sandboxing and facilitating some of the early research and development. Who takes ownership and long-term stewardship of this going forward? Um, all those concerns are going to be built into our what we're calling the MDOD blueprint, sort of a concept of operations for what our internal federal program looks like, what our focus area is going to be, what the outputs are going to be, and using that as a springboard to help us provide that necessary support to our stakeholders to make sure that at the state and local government level, at the industry level, the capabilities exist to take the principles that are being developed for MDODE and put them into practice in real world deployment of MDODE data. So that's a glimpse of our, kind of where we're going with the roadmap. Probably hope to have some more public rollout of the specifics of the MDOD program here in the next several months. But I appreciate the opportunity to sort of give you a preview of what we're working on here. So thank you. And I think with that, there we go. Hand it over to Q&A.
Caitlin, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Knew it was going to happen eventually. So looks like we have a couple questions here in chat. Are there any plans for upgrading the WZDX to connected work zone specification? Todd or Mark, could you guys take that one?
Well, there are definitely plans to upgrade the work zone data exchange spec to the connected work zone standard. This question might be more for Aaron to see if TxDOT is going to upgrade to the new version. Not sure about that, but that standard is coming. It's close to the end of the publication process that ITE, the Institute for Transportation Engineers, is orchestrating, and we can share that information when it's ready.
And then looks like the next one, is there any federal funding available for WZDX? Todd, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think the question of federal funding, I mentioned the demonstration grants that we did several years ago. Unfortunately, that was a one-time grant program. Whether that's revived at some point in the future is an open question. But many of the activities that are involved with creating the IT infrastructure and the back office capability for generating work zone data exchange data sets it falls under the category of existing federal funding eligibilities. So we're actually putting together a fact sheet on not just WZDX, but the broader MDODE funding program eligibility to specifically answer that question, and we'll be releasing that in the next several months.
Excellent. And I think one more for you. How do we collaborate on mode and or I'm sorry, MDODOD and node so we can inform on additional data exchange work being coordinated?
Yeah, feel free to drop me a note. We're actively reaching out to our stakeholders that we've already identified. If there's other interest, certainly just send me an email, and we'll see what we can do to get you into the workflow. We will be, setting up working groups and um, stakeholder engagement activities going forward. So we want to appreciate the interest.